Hello once again everyone, and welcome back to Nitty Gritty. So, it's been a while since I've been in the series, and as we know with this, I'm not really following any general progression, though we are still relatively on the outer sort of extension of this. We've done some footwork, handwork, extension, things like that. Today I want to talk about something in particular because the discussion came up with some of my students about pell work, and in particular, an aspect of pell work that is very important when it comes to building up the not just power of your strikes, but the presence of your strikes. And so I've got a couple weapons that I'm going to explain that as we go through, and joining me is my intrepid student, Bob. So, firstly, what am I on about? Basically, what I'm discussing is when you're hitting a pell, it can be very, very easy to get in the habit of just hit hard. And sure, you should every once in a while, especially if you've been working on activation, play around with how much can I generate, especially against a safe target like Bob or things along those lines, right? Just seeing what you can actually exert, because it's good to know you can. However, with the exception of what I would define as finishing blows, i.e. my opponent is already on the ground, probably being held down by some of my buddies, boom, let's put him out of commission, that's not necessarily a terribly useful thing. Even in regards to like cutting practice, striking that way against a solid object is no good. You'd be better off just cutting through on the air, as I've talked about before. So instead, from the majority of your strikes, since they're trying to get you something, as well as still exert force, but it's force in a targeted area, we get what I refer to as the laser beam. Now, what this means is I want you to imagine, well, first let's add some vocabulary to this first. As far as a strike, what it's most similar to is it's not similar to swinging something. Swinging something, sure, you can swing, but the trick about a swing is that you're looking to get force going in the direction of your swing. So like baseball, we want things to go that way. Versus the idea of a throw, so literally throwing an object out, casting it away from you in a relatively straight line, is much more in line with how your strikes should feel. That's true of your thrusts and cuts with one-handed sword. It should be about extension. And as such, when it comes to this laser beam idea, what I want you to think about is, imagine if when I do my cut here, rather than my cut just terminating, instead a beam of energy shoots out of the end of my sword and continues going where I'm focusing it. So for example, if I do a through cut, I'm still sending it out, I'm not sending it down. So I shouldn't have my cut go like that, that's sending it downward. Instead, what I'm doing is I'm sending it out, and then my cut just continues. Same thing if I do a half cut. All of my energy is going out that way. Now, this actually manifests in a physical sense. When you strike a target, where that force is going can be felt. One of the more common things that causes people to hit too hard, in particular on the shoulders, or God help you if they hit your hands, is that when people chop, they're chopping down. They look like they're hitting a target, but all their energy is going downward, and thus all that terminates, on top of the shoulder, into the hands, things like that, or worse, they catch you in the side of the head. That hurts a lot, right? Because that is the idea of swinging with the sword rather than striking. Versus, if I'm striking out, even if I activate everything, all of it's going out past Bob. You can even hear a physical difference in the sound. So here's that once again. This is a chop. I'm going to swing with equal strength both times, right? Versus this is an extension. There is difference in how his base is vibrating because of where the energy is going. Ideally, I want it to go into where I'm hitting and then past it. This is especially true on thrusts. So, what does this do linking back to pell work? Because that's true in everything. Like even if I'm doing a thrust, for example, on a thrust predominant weapon, it's still the idea of I should extend and thrust past my target, almost like I'm shooting out that beam, so that when I hit target, now I'm creating that flex. So, what does this have to do with pell work? Like I said, it's not about just hitting the pell, in particular when you're doing a specialized strike, because sure, just being able to cut through your target and dealing with that resistance is useful. But when you're looking at something, for example, the thing most people like to do against pell, which is zwerk, right? It can be very easy to end up just doing this, which is kind of pointless. Sure, you are training the activation with your left hand. If your right hand's hurting, you're not doing it enough. But it's it's not really going to give you a good Zwerchau. It's going to give you the ability to cut a Zwerch strongly, but not a good Zwerchau. So, in particular, if you're looking at a specialized strike, such as something like the Zwerch, which we're using as an example here because that's what my student was dealing with, what you should be looking at is, what am I trying to get with it? What I'm trying to get with my Zwerch is that outwardness. My beam is shooting out from the tip of my sword / about here with the short edge into target, past target, right? So here's Bob. I'm not going to hit him on this, but as I move, where my beam is going is through his head, right where I was lined up with. That's where I want all of that energy to land. That's where I want it to be effective. What I don't want when I do this is for all that energy to go toward the camera. That would be that, which it hits harder, it sounds larger, and it's in theory kind of stronger to do, sort of. Really, it's more just using more muscles. That's not what I'm looking for. That just leads to me swinging too hard, and then if I hit empty air, sword's going to go away. Versus, I can achieve that same amount of strength, etc., just by doing this, and if I miss, I won't go any further. It's to the point of effective extension, and then it's done. That's how your strikes on your pell should feel. It should not be, I'm hitting the pell, hitting the pell, hitting the pell. It should be, I'm cutting through target, cutting through target, cutting through target. And sure, I'm meeting resistance that's making it so I can't drag through after I finish my cut, but that's okay. Cut's already done. It's going past the target. Now, for those of you that don't do longsword, enough longsword, let's start talking about something else. Same idea is true with the single-hand sword, more so even, because now, depending upon what single-hand swords you're doing, if you're doing something that passes, such as sword and buckler, mess, or whatever, then yeah, same exact feeling. If you're doing it with the lunge, it's emphasized even more. So, what we're doing now is when I support my cut, which works in the exact same way, with that lunge, it means that it's even more guaranteed to go in a straight line. With a single-hand sword in a linear system, your cut should feel almost indistinguishable from your thrusts. What I mean by that is, it's not that you won't through cut. You absolutely can. That's why Milanese, etc. exists. It's not that you won't shoulder cut even on occasion or things along those lines, but those are your wider plays. That's when you either hit nothing and need to return to center, or you're already traversing, doing other things, etc. When you're using the lunge, the difference between me cutting and me thrusting should be very no differences in how they feel in my activation. The only thing that changes is the lead up to it and the position of my hand when I finish, which even then isn't necessarily all that different. A thrust and fourth, I'm locking out the inside line. A number one cut, I'm locking out the inside line. So, once again, imagine that beam coming off the tip of my sword. When I do my cut, it goes past his head, I return. And that's true on all of your cuts. Even the ones from below, it's going out into target, not up through the target. Now there are exceptions to this. Right now I'm doing all deep body targets because Bob only has a deep body, sorry about it. If he had a limb or things along those lines, then that's when you can start looking at the idea of going through the target. The same is also true when you're dealing with a sword or binding or things like that. That should feel a little bit different, but not that different. What I want to get into the habit of doing is having force, but if suddenly Bob were able to leave or I leave, nothing changes. I'm not trying to add extra, unless I am actively pursuing. So even if I am cutting through a limb or onto a blade or things along those lines, it's to a point and then I'm done. It's to a set shape. Now, like I said, in regards to the thrust, should feel pretty much exactly the same, but this in particular, particularly with rapiers, small swords, etc., you get a little bit of added bonus. So first off, one, if you aren't using your rapier, your small sword, whatever, on a pell, here's how you do so. Number one, you can still cut, absolutely, but you'd probably be better off just going ahead and cutting with something like a dussac or a wooden trainer or things along those lines so you don't tear up your pell or break your sword blade. Because while these can cut quite effectively, they are on the thinner side. In particular, if you're using something with like a triangular blade and a small sword, you can't cut at all. But anyway, point being, let's talk about flex. So the reason that swords flex, and this is also true if you ever are using a steel longsword or messer or what have you, the reason that swords flex when we hit is not just to prevent our opponent from getting hurt, it's also to show that we are thrusting correctly. So what I mean by this is, right now, my hand is lined up perfectly with my tip because they're connected by the blade. When you hit a target, if your hand is still in the right place, then the tip will bow, preferably upwards, because you're exerting force forwards and aren't yielding. If it's going downwards, that's not necessarily such a good thing, because now it's popping down out of your hand rather than into your hand. This is true regardless of whether or not my hand is down or up. It's comfortable and strong because I'm forcing forward, or comfortable and strong because I'm forcing downward. It will always flex up, never down. As such, what you'll see when people thrust, and this is not a good habit, is they'll land and then they'll let their hand relax, they'll let their wrist relax to try and keep the blade straight to be nice to their opponent. Don't do this. Reason being is it's building a really bad habit in two regards. Number one is that by doing this, I'm bringing myself closer to target, right? If we're just, playing tag, then things are fine, but if we're dealing with any sort of follow through, I'm in a really bad position to reactivate and defend. And in particular, if I'm getting really close to my opponent, I'm letting my sword yield all the way back, this is bad. Another reason is because it can hurt your wrist rather significantly. In particular, if you're in secunda/second, this can fold over that way and be bad for you. If you're going into fourth, this is more natural, but also has a higher chance of your sword popping out of your hand. You don't want that to be that much of a possibility. Instead, let the blade do its job. Flex correctly with your body behind it, it'll do that. Now there are exceptions to this, of course. There are times where you need to be considerate of, okay, the blade can only flex so much. Because basically what this is representing is the point going through him. A good example of this would be when I thrust below the sword with a passing step. So I will do this left-handed so the camera can see more easily. The idea here is I'm extending and I pass and I get that flex, right? There's a certain point though where I do start to let my arm yield because it has to. Realistically, the point would go through him, and as per Fabris, it's all the way till it whacks him and then we throw him. But since it can't here, once I've gotten my flex, that means my job is done. Now it is okay to go ahead and let that arm relax, but the key thing is I'm letting it relax from my elbow, which is very natural, versus from my wrist, which is, this hurts me so much to do. That's a very strong shape that you can relax because this, especially in second, nothing changes pressure-wise. In regards to hitting in fourth, this shouldn't really occur very much at all, but worst comes to worst, you can always let your back foot come out. It's not something you want to end up having to do, but if you have to, that's an easier way to exert. So, back to the main point of this though, that's how you get your feedback, right? Rather than whacking, though again, it should be the same as the cut. When you're doing your thrust, it should be good. That's directed thrust. Everything was right on that dime-sized target, regardless of what hit that I land with. So, all that is to say, cut, thrust, etc., you're always looking at projecting outward. Even when you're doing a through cut, it is that outward and then your cut just continues. When you're working with the pell, don't get stuck in the idea of, oh, I'm just whacking the pell, because that's not necessarily very effective. It should be that idea of I am directing my cut through my target, however I may get there, or my thrust, and I'm getting the results therein. If you're doing it with a steel, then you will get the ability to see, well, on the thrust at least, you'll get the ability to see flex. If you are doing it with just some sort of harder material, then you're usually cutting anyway. But either way, thank you very much, Bob. And thank you all very much for watching. I'm going to try and get this series going regularly again. Just kind of depends on what topic I find myself wanting to talk about when it comes to the nitty-gritty. And so if you have any suggestions, please put them in the comments below, because it gives me something to look forward to. But either way, thank you very, very much for watching. We'll go with some other techniques another time.